Okay, now I'd like to go ahead and move on to the first subject of the day, and that is something called moral debt. I discussed it a little bit in my book, but I'm going to sort of explain it a little bit better right now. Moral debt is an interesting word, an interesting couple of words. I actually took this concept, as I do with much of what I talk about in my book, from another writer. I didn't come up with all this stuff. I read from other brilliant people, and I interpret it in my own way, which I am now giving to you so that maybe you can tell somebody else the way that you took it, or things that you added on to that concept. Now, moral debt is something that was introduced to me by an author named David Graeber. He's one of my favorite authors, and he wrote a book called Debt, The First 5,000 Years. He's a self-proclaimed anarchist. He is also a professor in the UK, and he actually has a copy of my book, which I'm really happy about. But moral debt is the idea that we can use someone's morals or ethics to our advantage. We can say, I'm going to use your morality to accomplish my agenda. Now, what does that really imply? Let's take a very small example. You and I, the royal you and I, each one of you, we are out at a shopping center. We're having a day shopping, right? And while we're shopping, you are planning to rob the jewelry store across the street. You've been trying to do this for years, and you finally figured out how to do it. And I am not aware of your plan. But you're going to do it that day. Now, a wrench gets thrown in the gears. While we're across from the jewelry store, you happen to notice there's a police officer stationed outside today. He's usually not there, but he is today. And you're thinking, man, that really ruins my plan to rob that jewelry store. Yep, foiled again. So you're looking around, you're trying to figure out a way around this. And you happen to see an individual jaywalking a few blocks down. And they're holding up traffic, they're moving kind of slow. Perhaps it's an elderly individual, perhaps they have a disability, who knows, maybe they're just being hard to deal with. And they are just at a snail's pace crossing the road, holding up traffic. So you tell me, you turn to me while we're shopping, and you say, man, that guy's gonna get hit by a car. We better tell that police officer. We better go tell him and get him to help. And I think, man, you're right, I see it too, and I'm like, this is bad. We need to go tell him, so I go and tell him. You've triggered my morality and my sense of ethics to try and help this situation. So you prompt me to get the police officer, and I do. I get him and I take him over there, and while he's solving that issue, while we're both over there, you rob the store. You have used my ethics and my morality to accomplish your agenda. Now, that's pretty easy to understand, right? It gets a lot bigger than that. A lot bigger. Before I give you examples as to how this fits in with government, let me remind you that our morality and our ethics are an affirmation of our ego. That's who we are. That is our sense of self. When we do something that we deem moral or good or ethical, that reinforces who we are, and that makes us feel more confident as an individual. This is a really important concept. You are your morality. The things that you think are right are so important to you. Would you be a person without them? And you have to impose these things. Not only do you have to impose these things as an individual, but a nation has to impose these things because that affirms national identity. And what is a nation without an identity? A failed state. We have to have an identity to be a nation or an individual. Only through affirming our morals, or even perhaps imposing our morals, are we a nation or are we a person. So, the first example of moral debt that I'm going to talk about is in regards to our domestic policy. Bailouts. Bailing out a bad business. I could go with the obvious 2008, but I'm going to go with a bit of a longer standing model, just because this has been going on much longer, but rest assured, all of the concepts I'm about to describe are the same. Lockheed Martin is an aeronautics and munitions company, bailed out in 1971, probably by no coincidence at the loss of the Bretton Woods system and removal of the gold standard. That's another subject. However, they were bailed out because they were performing poorly as a business. They were not doing well as a business. They had models that were defunct and did not work. So the government steps in when they go out of business and says, all right, we're going to pick you back up and we're going to pay you your capital every year to continue production of what we need, right? How was this sold to the public? Obviously, if we actually look at what's going on, there's a bunch of Lockheed Martin lobbyists and former employees become politicians, blah, 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 but why do we accept it? We accept it because moral debt was placed upon us and is continually placed upon us every year to subsidize their business. Here's the form it takes. How can we let Lockheed Martin's failures put hundreds of thousands of people out of jobs? What about the workers? We must feel for the workers. We have to save the workers from the terrible things that Lockheed Martin has done to their business. So the government steps in to save the workers. Does that make sense to you guys, base level? Yeah, because it's triggering your morality, right? You don't want to be out of a job. We should be nice to the workers. We should help them. It's not their fault that Lockheed had a bad business model. That was in 1971. They are still subsidized this year. Here's what that means for you as a taxpayer and for me. My tax dollars pay their operating capital, and they take no bid contracts from the government to sell their goods, which means I pay for it twice. Not only do I pay for their business to operate, I also pay for their product. I pay twice for everything Lockheed Martin does. To an even further extent, let's think about this rationally. For all that money, could we not have just bailed out the employees at Lockheed Martin in 1971? Would it not have been cheaper to give them a severance stipend and let the company go under? Even more to the point, how many people are we hurting? Let's see by comparison. More Americans are hurt by the fact that we have to continue subsidizing this business. That is a burden on all taxpayers. Far more people than employed at Lockheed Martin. Not only that, but when we have to print more money, it becomes worth less. That's a weird concept. So, making an analogy out of that, let's say the whole world is crazy for apples. Apples are now heroin, and we all have a problem, right? So, there's a problem. There's only 5,000 apples in the world. How much is each apple worth if we all want an apple, but there's only 5,000? Yeah, who knows? $500 million an apple? Highest bidder for an apple? Thank God that's not the case. They're 50 cents, but that's because there's a surplus of them. Your money is a commodity, just like an apple. When we have more apples, they become worth less. When we have more money, it becomes worth less. This is why a gallon of milk cost $1 in 1980 and costs $5 or $6 now. And it is directly correlated to instances like Lockheed Martin and the fact that they are stretching our money and ruining our money over time. Does that not hurt more people than if we had just subsidized the workers and not the company? This applies to banking. It applies to any sort of tech or agriculture. Anything that is government subsidized often has this caveat with it. I'm not saying that this is a binary. I'm not saying that subsidies are inherently bad. But I am saying we have to unlearn why we give them and unlearn how our morality can be used against us. If we really cared about the workers, why wouldn't we give the workers the money? I don't care about Lockheed, but I do care about the individuals. Why not give them the money directly? Now, let's make another example out of this with moral debt. This one is a bit more upsetting in a lot of ways because we're actually talking about life and death.
Right.
And at the end, I promise there will be
Happiness.
yes, there is overall happiness. But you got to remember, growth is about accepting things. It's like when you're a kid and you got growing pains. You always wanted to be taller, but it really hurts to get taller.
Yeah, right.
Now, part of stopping these things is understanding them. You can't stop something you don't understand. Now, the next one I'm going to talk about is Syria. And I'm talking about it because it is very, very relevant right now. And I want to also remind you guys, I am not taking a partisan stance. I am simply recounting what has happened. I don't know how much the executive branch actually knows about the policies. I don't know who's pulling the strings. I can take plenty of guesses, but that's not why I'm here. I'm here to tell you what actually happened. So, moral debt in Syria. During the Obama administration, we were shown horrible images of Syrian people being gassed and being killed by the Bashar al-Assad Alawite government. When we are shown these images, how does it make us feel? Already the moral hooks are in. And that is not something that's bad. We need that empathy in this world. But that's the beginning. When you feel your morality being hit with that hook, start thinking about this. So we have to go in and, for moral reasons, save the Syrian people. Go in and save them because this is unacceptable and we cannot stand idly by. Our morality, our identity will not let us stand idly by letting these people die. It is wrong, right? Surface level, absolutely, 100% correct. However, here's how it actually played out. We already have American troops in Afghanistan, Pakistan, Iraq, Somalia, Yemen, the UAE, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, Jordan. Am I missing any? Probably.
We're in 66 nations.
Thank you, sir. And especially in the Middle East, we have set up shop. Now, under a progressive-style president like Barack Obama, sending American troops to Syria would not have been a popular decision. In fact, it's one of the few rallying cries I've seen between Democrats and Republicans. They both said no. So, another idea was placed, is that we arm moderate rebels. Syria, you have to understand, the climate in Syria is very important to this. It is a secular nation, but the vast majority of the government and the military is run by a sect of Shia Muslims called Alawites. Shia and Sunni are not the same. In fact, they butt heads quite a bit. Because the government is controlled by a Shia minority, there is a burning underside of revolution that is spearheaded by the Sunnis. So when we say that we're going to arm rebels, we're really saying that we're arming Sunnis. Who else is Sunni? Al-Qaeda, al-Nusra, ISIS, we're all Sunni. We made the decision based on morality to arm insurgents who ended up making Syria an even more regressive state and ruining it further, possibly worse than the al-Assad government did. It's really hard to gauge something like that. You can't say it's worse because they're both bad, right? So then we're faced with another moral problem. We have to get rid of ISIS because they're doing terrible things and we're seeing terrible videos. And now we still have this moral debt on us. We are still in the same feedback loop of moral debt. We have to get rid of ISIS now. So international coalitions eventually quell ISIS, and what happens? Bashar al-Assad returns. And the country's still in a civil war, and the average Syrian civilian is no better off. Now, I am not defending Bashar al-Assad, nor am I defending any of the other people I'm about to list. But do you think that Libya was better off with Muammar Gaddafi in charge than the tribal, feudal, terrifying reality that they have now? It used to be one of the most successful states in Africa. And now, it's all a war zone. Do you think Iraq was better under Saddam Hussein than what it is now, a tribal, feudal, regressive, third world state, compared to at least some semblance of authority that was holding some semblance of strings together? These are tough questions, because I'm not defending these people. I'm not defending authoritarianism. I'm not defending the way that these individuals ran their governments. But I am saying, did using your moral debt, the government using your moral debt, did that actually help? Now, the one key component we're missing is if your moral debt was used against you, for what reason? What was the proverbial jewelry store? In Iraq, I think most of us have accepted it's probably oil, right? But that's not the same for the whole Middle East. To really get these concepts, you have to understand each country. You have to understand each climate. They're all different. They're all different. The big thing with Syria and Israel and anything along the Fertile Crescent, you have to understand that this is a trade route that has been in demand for hundreds, thousands of years. This is a trade route that gives you access to Europe, the Middle East, Asia, Africa, and out towards the Americas. If you control the Fertile Crescent in the Mediterranean, you control global trade. This was especially important in World War II, because in World War II, that's how the Allies got their oil. They shipped them down the Zagros Mountains, through Syria, out into the Mediterranean Sea to fuel the Allied effort on the Western Front. That's how the Western Front was won. If it were not for Allied occupation of Syria and Palestine at the time, the Western Front probably would have lost. Now that oil company, fun side note, was actually run by Prescott Bush, George Bush's grandfather, which is probably why they have a weird obsession with the region, right? Those were the good old days for that family. Now, all of this, I want to impart to you before we move on to the next example. I don't watch the news. I don't like the news. The news. I don't like it. Because I learned everything I just told you from reading, from history. Once you understand why Syria was valuable in World War II, and prior to that, with the Phoenicians even, all the way back to ancient history, the war in Syria takes on a different light. No longer are we talking about Bashar al-Assad. We're talking about trade and control of trade. That makes a lot more sense to me. The final thing that I will talk about in regards to moral debt is how many of you are familiar with an individual named Thomas Malthus? Thomas Malthus. Would you like to?
No.
Economist.
Yes, he was an economist.
Economics, don't tell me what the tenants are, I don't remember it.
Yep, he was an economist. So he was a macroeconomist, just like you said. He was a professor, and I believe he lived around probably late 1600s, early 1700s. But the interesting thing about Thomas Malthus, and this will fit into moral debt, this is a man that influenced minds like Alfred Russel Wallace and Charles Darwin. Very important with evolutionary theory and understanding our natural world. But Thomas Malthus had a very interesting take on the future of humanity. So, according to his essays on the principle of population, Thomas Malthus said that over a certain period of time, there would be more people than we could reasonably sustain on the planet. So he was predicting overpopulation. And the ways that we could stop overpopulation was forced sterilization, making there be a limit on how many kids somebody can have, cleansing of the third world, and abortions to the lower and middle class, making them readily available. All of these things had pretty racial over or undertones to them at that point in time. But Malthus was wrong. He thought this would happen in the 1800s, but something interesting happened in the 1800s. We experienced the first industrial and technological revolutions, which meant that our crops and our food and everything that we needed could be created at an exponential amount, faster, better, get them to where they need to be more quickly and easily. So the Malthusian catastrophe that he predicted never happened because technology grows at a rate that is exponentially higher than population. So here's the underlying problem. We still talk about overpopulation today. I'm not saying it's real. I'm not saying it's not real. But I am saying that the agenda behind depopulation and a lot of the rhetoric used by politicians about depopulating the world and taking steps to prevent overpopulation, perhaps are they using our morality of an impending Malthusian catastrophe to change the way that we think and sanction things like culling the third world? It's possible. I don't know if it's factual, but it is possible. When we hear about non-governmental organizations or the UN talking about overpopulation in Uganda, I hear the echoes of Thomas Malthus. And I have to. I have to, because we aren't talking about overpopulation in New York City, where there is a predominantly first world, many, many white folks. We're talking about the third world because they're the ones that are impoverished. Is there not poverty in New York City? Has anybody here ever been to Skid Row? Is that not poverty? Is that not a refugee camp? Are we talking about culling them? Not yet. We have to think about these things. I'm not convinced that I'm right about it. I'm not. But I think about it because it's important.